relations with China advanced so obviously and so marvelously. Economically, we're very close, the trading partners. And we say some sort of Chinese concept, where 互联互通 in English is interconnectivity, now is a leading concept to underline such not just the geographical, we say, intimacy between the China and ASEAN, but also signifying some sort of unprecedented, some sort of closeness almost in all the terms. If you talk to the Chinese media people and the Chinese scholars, so what's the ASEAN truly mean for China? Then a lot of people will say it's exactly sitting in some sort of, we say, central fragment of Chinese diplomacy. That means it's a peripheral diplomacy. So peripheral diplomacy is a very peculiar concept to describe how Beijing proceeds with its relations to the outside world, because China is mostly neighbored power in the world. Both in land and sea, we also have totally 22 neighbors. So such a, we say, neighborhood-centric relationship usually is a key bond of Chinese relations with outside. Then if we just go back to the Deng Xiaoping era, then we'll see a lot of the Chinese confidence came out of such a better improvement of our relations with the Chinese neighborhood, because we quickly ended up ideological, we say some sort of such a foreign relations, and we finish all, the revolution expert back to the 60s and 70s. So when China entered the 80s, then we will see a developmental China is truly just regains and some sort of, we say, a main momentum of China's relations. Then Beijing opened up, then Beijing also reached out in a way very friendly. So then that kind of China relay the foundation for China-ASEAN relations. So in Deng's sense, it's a good neighborhood relationship. So then such a good neighborhood relationship is become very fruits with a bearing. So back to the 90s, early 90s, China normalized all relations with ASEAN. Then 10 years later, we also conclude the China-ASEAN FTA. Then we will see such a relations is truly jumped over some sort of a historical new height. So what's the China's relations with ASEAN? As I say, if we just looking back the past 3 decades, it's much China's reform open up driven. It's also friendship or good neighborhood based. Then it's also hospitality, we say tapped some sort of new movement. Then Beijing historically reconfigured our relations with ASEAN. Of course, it win China a lot of friends. It win China a lot of market access, and it win China a lot of reputations. It also very distinctively from some sort of, we say, cultural revolution driven the China's foreign relations with ASEAN. Because back to the 60s, 70s, China supports the communist guerrillas in ASEAN. We also export relations, revolutions. We also would like to see a communist China could also expand into our neighborhood. But that kind of things is ultimately and also very overly just terminated. So then in the past 2 decades, then we will see, since the end of the Cold War, then we will see the good relationship between China and ASEAN coincides with the Beijing's economic developmentalism. It's also some sort of a collision of the two kinds of historical forces. One is the neighborhood turning into economic and commercial incentive because we're neighbor. On the other hand, we also see it's also very mutually beneficial and mutually complementary relations. China's market, China's export of the import of raw materials, and China's export of, we say, such a cheap goods, then just to refabricate a very close relationship between the China and ASEAN. It's a history making. It's also new grounds, we say, breaking. Then we will see China and ASEAN relations truly took a bigger tide and navigating into the new historical phase. Relationship has never been closer and we say some sort of, we say mutually reachable. But now, China-ASEAN relations is going beyond a lot them sort of traditionally defined good neighbor relations. China-ASEAN is two very important players in the region. Our relations also should go a lot beyond some sort of such as just a geographical proximity driven relationship. For example, a couple of the new questions hitting our bilateral relations very, very expressively and impressively. For example, what kind of security common goods we can share? What sort of a regional org we can lining up, building up? The most important thing is, in one way, China-ASEAN relations could very successfully accommodate another powers, just like the US, Japan, India, and other very proactive actors in the region. So our relations has never been, we say, navigating into some sort of new historical phase. That kind of a developmentalism-driven relationship is behind us. Now, we needed to accommodating each other. We needed to fitting each other into some sort of a new historical context of a regional relationship. When we're looking at the US, China, Japan, and other bigger players, they also just step in one after another into some sort of a new stormy climates in East Asia. Then how China and ASEAN fit ourselves into some sort of such a new configuration. A couple of elements centralized such a new context or new trend. One is, in one way, and how genuine the power shift now is emerging. China, US stop predominance, China's rise, power disparity now is elusive, or Americans' supremacy remain untouchable and unchangeable. If it is happening, so in what space, then China's new foreign policy could be taken into account in ASEAN's capital. That means how relations could be remade to, befriend China, simultaneously befriend the US. Then we will see friction now is spilling over. Then second factor is, of course, probably we will have some sort of roughly restructured regional order. That means security and economy corrects. In economy, of course, China become almost the #1 trading partner to most of the ASEAN members. But in security, very expectably, the ASEAN remain take the US as the most dependable, most trustable reliance. So such as security and economy cracks also has never been running deeper and broader. The question also simultaneously just hitting the Chinese and ASEAN. Is there any way such a sophisticated balance could be remade between the ASEAN, US, and China? And how ASEAN could fit its foreign policy recalibrate some of the strategic shifts of Americans' regional security policy, for example, rebalancing. It's targeting China, but the problem is how ASEAN follow up. Then the question also just how to say quickly impressed the entire region. That means ASEAN will just join the US side to rebalance of China, or ASEAN probably will stand back a little bit to put the two powers in some sort of a parallel. That means the ASEAN would like to just how say take some sort of impartial policy stance over the two powers, US and China. Then how long such a no-side-taking policy could persist? Of course, Chinese is very speculative. ASEAN country probably also now is weighing how ASEAN could well fit itself between the two powers. Of course, if we think further, then we'll see a couple of new questions coming. For example, since the Abe administration came to the power, Japan vying with China for the influence in ASEAN. The Tokyo also would like to take in ASEAN into the Japan side and using ASEAN as the way to rebalancing a rising China. But the problem is, to what extent the China-Japan relations will be depending on future ASEAN's choice. Another question related is, in what way the ASEAN would like to balance the both regional players, China and Japan. ASEAN would like to use the Japan to counterbalance China, or ASEAN would like to use the China to show some sort of strategic imperative to press the Japan getting more generous in just the house flexing out some sort of Japan's capital and Japan's help. Then we will see such a things also running very interestingly high in the past 2 and 3 years. So ASEAN's question is, it's not just how say seeing some sort of side taking between China and US. Given some sort of a tighten up of the power wrestling between the China and the Japan, how the ASEAN reposition itself. At least that question just how say has never been more presently influenced the Chinese thinking. Okay, given that, then we will see we need to some sort of readjustment or need some sort of a recalculation. What kind of the China-ASEAN relations will be just how say back to some sort of a more sustainable trajectory, and how China assess the ASEAN's role, and in what way we can also undercut some sort of a diplomatic friction over the South China Sea and advancing our relations more in strategic sense. As I mentioned, that question has never been getting more significant and more desired for Chinese thinkers. So my conclusion is that China and ASEAN, we need to recalibrate our relations. We should get out of a traditional definition of a relation, just a good neighborhood. We should push the ASEAN on the way the ASEAN centrality could be more workable. We also should emboldening the ASEAN to play a bigger role, not just how say repositioning itself among the powers, but also really bring up the ASEAN's creator, ASEAN's significance, ASEAN's strategic weight. So moment has never been, more interestingly coming. What kind of ASEAN role we should envision, we should encourage, we should also co-sponsoring with our neighbors. To be honest, that's an untested, the question for Chinese leadership and the Chinese government. Okay, let me come down to a couple of my points to, let's say, briefly touching on some sort of recalibration of the China-ASEAN relations. First, what's the new contextuality of ASEAN centrality? We know ASEAN centrality. It's a very important driving force for regional cooperation and integration. But there is some sort of remarkable contradiction with the ASEAN centrality per se. That means ASEAN is a very important player, but compared to the China, US, and Japan, ASEAN seem less able to set the agenda, drive up, some sort of, we say, such a cooperation program. So someone say ASEAN centrality is something just like driving, sitting at the back row. So we will see AIF, where I see the EAS, where I see the ASEAN +3. Now all such settings are interesting, but less effective. So now the problem is how to signify ASEAN centrality. ASEAN centrality should end up with its just some sort of, we say, design of convenience, and really just how say base the new power concept to encourage the ASEAN play a bigger role. ASEAN centrality is not just a traditionally defined, we say, such a middle powers diplomacy. ASEAN could be more proactive diplomacy, not just how say reading the power relations, but also could setting the agenda for the future evolution of the power relations. For example, South China Sea issue. Then we will see US-China will get into the military confrontation. No, I don't think so. I see the current friction between US and China is more legal, more diplomatic than military. You can imagine Chinese and Americans will become a paranoid, just fighting over such a, we say, very tiny tribal rocks and reefs? No. But the problem is, it's not easy for US and China to terminate their frictions. China-US strategic rivalry has been flaring over the South China Sea. That's why even just island construction and some sort of a sequential UNCLOS-based, we say, such arguments really now drive the both sides into some sort of, we say, brink of the military flash. But the problem is when the US and China arguing and just we say breaking of the South China Sea, where is the role of ASEAN? What's the choice of ASEAN, and what's some sort of the very clear statement that ASEAN would like to issue in the, just how reiterating the South China Sea issue? Then we will see so far it's very ambiguous. So that's why, for me, the future South China Sea issue, we need some sort of a more positive ASEAN engagement. Otherwise, then we'll see if just the China-US left in some sort of a boxing ring, who is coach? Who is a really some independent voice to keep the both sides, even boxing, but in a way where it's normative. We need ASEAN. We need ASEAN to just iterating a very independent voice, rather than just the house lying in dependent with a track and looking at the US-China's friction with the handoff. The second, ASEAN centrality means ASEAN's enhanced reunity. So far, we also see ASEAN has been divided. For example, so Philippines now is a very solid ally to the US. Then probably they open up a new military basis for American soldiers' relocation, probably also will raise the concern of the China. So what's the ASEAN's unified voice in presenting the ASEAN's presence when the US-China in some sort of such a collision course? We would like to see a divided and weak ASEAN. Otherwise, ASEAN is such a split, also will just leave some sort of a great base for great power to take advantage of. If the China ASEAN's reunity could enhance and reinforce, then we will see that will be conceivably a very interesting reference for all powers in the region to make. ASEAN is not a reference. ASEAN is not a coach. ASEAN could be independent counterweight to any powers who are supposed to abuse the power. If China abuses power, I welcome ASEAN to just how say lift the red card. When the U.S. do that, is there any way ASEAN could just show the U.S. red card? But as I say, ASEAN's diplomatic activism and a relatively independent conway could be serve as some sort of a delicate balance among the powers. Third, when we talk about the ASEAN centrality, probably we also need to gauge some sort of a very controversial issues well approached in a way coordinated and cooperated. I'll give you an example. COC negotiation topple China ASEAN's official context. It's also long-term efforts by both sides to stabilize the South China Sea. But if the US and Japan will be in high profile, militarily intervene in the South China Sea, I will see that will be a very reckless denial to the feasibility of concluding the COC. No one can imagine China would like to conclude the COC, tightening up its hands and fingers when it was severely threatened by US and Japan. For example, we will see the Americans' USS destroyer poaching into the closed water area of the China's islands on construction. It's not just a part of the, we say, freedom of navigation attempt. It's a very, very less, we say, military intimidation to China. Whatever the dispute will be, in terms of the UNCLOS, of the maritime, we say, such features and maritime entitlement centered around the construction islands. But the problem is the US used the military decoys to, seal very close to the islands on construction. As I say, it's a provocation. It's a military, we say, intimidation. I don't know how long it will go and in what frequency Americans destroy sailing cruiser to islands and construction will continuously taking place. But the problem is, it's ominous signals. We understand Americans' motive behind the freedom of navigation, but so far, there's no single case. Beijing would like to impede on any move of freedom of navigations. So it's completely two things. One is, we say, big sponsorship of a freedom of navigation. On the other hand, it should be, we say, termination of a military intimidation. If the US put the two things together, as I say, that will leave our bilateral relations very grimmer. But sooner or later, no one can predict what kind of incidents will happen. Over this, what's the ASEAN's clear-cut attitude? Then we will see the ASEAN is very divided. The Philippines follow up very closely, saying it's very supportive. The rest of ASEAN prefer some sort of, let's say, silence. So when such a, risky things just happened, the China-ASEAN relations also have been very badly overshadowed by such a raised military risk. As I mentioned, as long as the US, along with the Japan, militarily meandering through the South China Sea issues, that will be scared Beijing back from any negotiation of a COC. Because we have to take a leverage to defend ourselves. It's the moment for ASEAN, China, and the other players to reconsider what kind of a regional attempt we should well coordinate for the purpose of the sustainable and achievable stability of South China Sea. On the other hand, I also have to say such an ASEAN centrality will be a big driver in the regional security order's evolution. I would like to say enhance the ASEAN role rather than just comfortably lying some sort of such a, we say, simplicity of a balance of a power policy, just putting two powers together and engaging such a two powers in a way as a bloc or in a way just divided. I love to see ASEAN's unity. I love to see ASEAN's unitary, independent, the contribution to the world's regional security. In the foreseeable future, China-US relations was out of control, will be getting more, we say, confrontational or more cooperative. Then if we just have a quick look at the nature and features of our relations, I don't think such a relations will just change very dramatically or rapidly without some sort of, we say, decisive input of a middle power diplomacy. So it will be trend. ASEAN's contribution and ASEAN's choice probably will be more decisive for the future's military and strategic posture between the US and China. For example, if the more ASEAN countries open the military bases around the South China Sea to the US and Japan, it may be, well, just force the Beijing to react. But if the ASEAN will see some sort of a strategic prudence and really like to put in both power into some sort of a diplomatic negotiations, then Japan, the US, and China as well probably will see less imperative to reverse the current course. So no one can be blind to such a growing significance of ASEAN role. If you would like to decide to play that kind of role in a way more consistent and more unified, that's really welcome by Chinese. Let me come to my conclusion. First, I think that China feel very satisfied over such an economic incentive-driven relationship with the ASEAN in past 2 decades. Then a lot of the comments and appraisal should be pointing to a big advancement of such a relations. Yes, when we got foreign, when we got very, very vigilant before the end of a Cold War, then there is some sort of a bigger market for China's threat in most of the ASEAN countries. The past 2 decades, we will see a very revolutionary change. China-ASEAN relations has never been getting better, but the problem is it's still far from enough. What's the new destination? What's the new punctuated target we can come after? The things has never been resounding to Beijing and ASEAN's capitals. Basically, we couldn't just resting ourselves on economic relationship. We couldn't resting ourselves on such an interconnectivity-driven relationship. ASEAN-China relationship should be armed with more strategic significance. Male-male relations, defense minister levels contacts, and negotiations are all such things on progress. But the problem is, we should make clear what kind of the security partnership China-ASEAN could refabricate, what kind of the security role we can accommodate each other, and even complementing each other. If we could move on that, some sort of a new phase of our relationship, we should broaden our vision. We should dig deeper into some sort of such intellectual resources and thinking about the future's architecture underlining China-ASEAN relations in terms of security interactions. My basic conclusion is ASEAN centrality should be re-signified, should re-armed with some sort of a new leverage and a new context. A more signified ASEAN centrality serve the China's interests. ASEAN should go beyond its some sort of a traditional concept of just positioning itself between the power and getting into some sort of a new trajectory. ASEAN could play a more proactive role, not rebalancing both power, but also could help just stabilizing the power relations. It's a challenge for ASEAN, but it's also a new inspiring for ASEAN as well. Second, for Chinese, we should think through a couple of things. In today's world and in today's region, what kind of China's diplomatic goal we should just firmly and unambiguously came after. China would like to discard the ASEAN card vis-a-vis US and Japan, or China would like to working together with US, Japan, ASEAN for some sort of solidified evolution of a regional order. It's a question for Beijing. But anyway, my hunch is that no power will benefit from any geopolitical divide in this region. ASEAN's future choice is mostly predictable. ASEAN now is carrying on the hedging strategy vis-a-vis China. Beijing should cast more understanding of this strategy. On the other hand, we should also seeding more on the confidence building, the attempt with the ASEAN members. ASEAN's reliance on the US as a security partner is also serve the China's interests. But China wants is, we don't want to see the ASEAN some sort of fragility in, we say, making such a relations. But so far, we will see it's more predictable. ASEAN country hold the line. ASEAN country would like to go your own way. You don't want to see just leaning toward China or leaning toward the US. Of course, it's also least a possibility leaning toward Japan. Beijing should raise the eyeball as broad as wide as we can to look to this reality. That kind of ASEAN serve the China's interests and also could be more entitled to play a productive role in the regional politics. Therefore, the China's security and strategic relationship with ASEAN is not a race with the US or Japan for some sort of, we say, such a side-taking or intimacy-making relationship. We should create a more diplomatic and strategic base for ASEAN to maneuver, for ASEAN to play. We also love to have a big and a high ASEAN voice. And every time such a voice coming over, Beijing will say, "We are well received." South China Sea issue now is a tasting ball. When the ASEAN minister levels conference just really and sincerely expressed the concern, I really hope my government could have it in mind very seriously. South China Sea issue now is a big concern for China. It's not some sort of courtesy. It's not applied words. It's a real. How Beijing could respond is a tasting for China's future smartness in readjusting China's foreign policy with ASEAN. But the problem is ASEAN also should sincerely tell us a strong and a high-profile military intervention of the US and Japan is also simultaneously opposed by ASEAN. We can achieve that. Of course, it's tastable, but it's also very, very, we say, dependable, and also worthwhile the new efforts of both sides. Let me stop here. Then any questions, comments, and presentations, I really welcome.